In the heart of the town, Judge Robert Mills sat at his desk in the courthouse, an imposing figure with a reputation for upholding the law without exception. His robes seemed to make him appear larger than life. He had become known over the years as someone who valued fairness above all things, but to some people his brand of fairness felt cold and distant, as if the law was a machine and he was merely its operator. The people who came before him were just numbers in a casebook. No one ever thought about the lives behind the charges or the weight of decisions that could change those lives forever. This afternoon, the courtroom was relatively quiet, the usual low murmur of voices echoing off the walls as the bailiff called the names of the people waiting their turn. Tamara Davis was the next name called. Her heart raced as she walked toward the stand, her heels clicking softly on the linoleum floor. She had been to court before, but never for something like this. Jaywalking. She couldn't believe she was even here. The charge felt so insignificant, but she knew it wasn't about the charge itself. It was about the principle. She didn't want to make a scene, but she wasn't about to let anyone treat her as if she didn't matter. Not today, not ever. Her eyes met Judge Mills across the room. He glanced up from his papers, briefly taking in her appearance. She was a woman in her early 30s, dressed in a simple but elegant outfit, a pale blue blouse and dark trousers. Her black hair was tied back in a neat ponytail. Her posture was confident, though her heart was racing. She didn't flinch under his gaze, but she felt something stir inside her, as if she had to prove something without saying a word. Mills motioned for her to take the stand, and without a hint of recognition or curiosity, he asked her to state her name and the nature of the infraction. She quickly explained the situation, admitting that she had crossed the street without using the crosswalk in a hurry to make it to a meeting. Her voice steady, her words clear and precise. She didn't apologize. She didn't make excuses. She just told her side of the story as simply as she could. Judge Mills didn't respond to her words right away. Instead, he flipped through the papers in front of him, his brow furrowing, as if he were looking for something else, something more than the facts before him. He had heard thousands of cases like this over the years. He had seen people who didn't care about the law and others who made mistakes out of pure ignorance. It was all the same to him. This was no different. He would give her a fine and move on, just as he had done for countless others. His eyes glanced at the clock ticking above the door, as if he was anxious to finish the case. He looked back at her, and then without hesitation, he spoke in his calm, authoritative voice. He announced that the fine would be $100, a small but firm sum for the infraction. He didn't consider her explanation to be of any consequence. She was just another person breaking the rules. It wasn't personal. It was simply the law. She nodded her acknowledgement, though she could feel the sting of the decision deep within her. She knew that this wasn't just about jaywalking. This was about something much bigger, something that she couldn't ignore. She left the courtroom without a word, but as she stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight, a storm was already building inside her. She had no idea how much this small act would change everything. What Judge Mills didn't know, what few in the courtroom could have imagined, was that Tamara Davis wasn't just another woman in a long line of minor offenders. She wasn't the kind of person who walked into a courtroom unnoticed or forgotten. Tamara had come back to her hometown not just to visit, but to make a difference. She had spent years away from this small town, earning a degree, building a life, and working in communities that needed her help. Her time in larger cities had shaped her into someone who understood the systemic struggles that people like her often faced. But now, back in her roots, she was determined to lift up the voices that were often ignored. Tamara's life was a quiet rebellion against the status quo. She worked behind the scenes, organizing local initiatives to help the underserved in her community, focusing on education, housing, and mental health. Her influence wasn't loud, but it was felt. Those who knew her knew how much she cared about people, how much she believed that everyone deserved a fair shot, no matter their background or circumstances. But her work in the community wasn't the kind of thing that was splashed across the local news. Tamara had always stayed out of the spotlight, preferring to let her actions speak for themselves. It wasn't until the fine that anyone really began to take notice of who she was. What Tamara also knew, but chose not to say in the courtroom, was that she was the sister of the town's mayor, Carla Davis, a rising political star who had gained recognition for her tireless work in bringing change to the town. Carla had spent years building relationships with the right people, pushing for legislation that protected the vulnerable and advocating for programs that improved the quality of life for people of color in the community. As mayor, she had made significant strides toward equality, and it was clear that she was a force to be reckoned with in local politics. But Tamara wasn't her sister. While Carla had become the face of reform and hope in the town, Tamara preferred to work behind the scenes, to put in the long hours where the work really mattered. She didn't want anyone to treat her any differently because of who her sister was. She believed in personal responsibility, in proving herself through her own merits. She could have easily used her sister's position to get out of the fine but chose not to. She didn't want special treatment, but she also knew that what had happened wasn't just a simple mistake. It felt personal. Walking out of the courthouse, Tamara felt the weight of the decision on her shoulders. It wasn't just about the fine. It was about what it represented. She wasn't sure what had led the judge to impose such a harsh penalty for a minor infraction, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. In the days that followed, her suspicions grew. The more she thought about it, the more she realized the town had changed over the years, but so had its people. Some were still stuck in old ways, holding on to prejudices they didn't even recognize in themselves. And then there was the matter of her sister. Carla was deeply invested in making the town better, but Tamara knew that political power often came at a cost. The spotlight was always on Carla, and Tamara found herself in the shadows, where she had to confront the biases and challenges others faced every day. What had happened in that courtroom felt like a small spark, one that could set off something much larger. She wasn't sure if she wanted to make it public or keep it quiet, but one thing was clear: she wasn't going to let this go. The judge had to answer for what he'd done, even if it meant her sister's involvement in ways she hadn't anticipated. As the days passed, news of the fine spread throughout the community, and the first ripples of public scrutiny began to reach her. Tamara had known this day might come, but she hadn't anticipated the force with which it would hit. The decision had been made, but now the real work was just beginning. Within days, Tamara's fine became the talk of the town, and not just because of the minor infraction itself. The fine, though small in monetary terms, was more than just an inconvenience. It was the catalyst for a growing storm of public outcry. Activists, especially those who had worked alongside Tamara in local grassroots initiatives, began to question why such a penalty was imposed on her. The debate quickly shifted from the question of jaywalking to the question of whether Tamara, someone deeply involved in the community and known for her tireless efforts to support marginalized groups, was being targeted unfairly. Word spread fast. Tamara Davis, sister of the popular and powerful Mayor Carla Davis, had been fined by Judge Robert Mills for a simple pedestrian violation. It didn't take long for the implications to sink in. For many in the town, the incident became a symbol of a deeper, more insidious issue: systemic racism, implicit bias, and a justice system that didn't always treat Black residents fairly. The town, with its long history of racial tension, seemed primed for a showdown. Tamara's supporters immediately began speaking out on social media and at local community meetings. Some called it what they saw it: an attempt to publicly shame Tamara, to remind her that even people like her, well-educated, hard-working, and well-connected, couldn't escape the judgment of the system. Others, particularly in the more conservative corners of the town, dismissed the concerns, arguing that the judge was simply doing his job and that the fine was nothing more than a matter of upholding the law. As the online discussions grew heated, local activist groups organized peaceful protests in front of the courthouse, demanding that Judge Mills review his decision. They argued that the fine was excessive, particularly for someone like Tamara, who was a fixture in local efforts to combat inequality. The protests were peaceful, but the message was loud and clear. The town's justice system wasn't as fair as it claimed to be, especially when it came to people of color. The growing public debate reached the ears of the local media, who quickly picked up the story. What had started as a minor court case was now front-page news, with local television stations broadcasting interviews with Tamara's supporters and critics alike. Some claimed that the judge's actions were just, while others saw them as evidence of an unjust system. Tamara, still stewing in quiet frustration, tried to avoid the spotlight. She didn't want to become a political pawn, but she couldn't ignore the powerful undercurrent of support that was rallying behind her. At the same time, she felt an uncomfortable pressure building. She knew the people who were now voicing their outrage had their own agendas. Some of them were more focused on advancing their causes than on actually helping her. Still, Tamara couldn't deny that the attention was forcing her to confront something she hadn't planned for. The realization that her sister's political power was both a blessing and a burden. Mayor Carla Davis, meanwhile, had heard the growing rumblings and felt the heat of the situation. At first, she remained silent, preferring to keep a low profile while the controversy played out. But it became clear that the public wasn't going to let the matter go easily, and it soon became evident that Carla had no choice but to step in. The mayor's political capital was built on promises of fairness and equality. She had been vocal about fighting racial injustice in the town, and now her own sister's experience was becoming a case study in just how far those promises stretched. Carla's team started receiving calls from the press asking for comment. Her colleagues, both allies and opponents, urged her to take a stand, one way or the other. What started as a minor infraction had turned into a firestorm that could threaten her carefully crafted political image. Still, Carla wasn't a woman who backed down easily, especially when it came to her family. Her next move was inevitable. She had to address the situation head-on and fast. But for now, Tamara remained at the heart of the debate, a quiet figure at the center of a growing storm. Despite her discomfort with the public attention, she knew she had a decision to make. Either she could let the town's anger burn out, or she could stoke the flames and demand justice. She chose the latter, even if it meant facing her sister's wrath. The battle for justice was never simple, but in that moment, Tamara knew it was a fight worth having. The tension between Tamara's supporters and the town's more conservative factions was reaching a boiling point, but it wasn't just the public outcry that Tamara had to worry about. As the controversy over her fine continued to simmer, the issue made its way directly into the political heart of the town. Her sister, Mayor Carla Davis. When Carla first caught wind of the situation, she was furious. She knew that Tamara didn't want special treatment. That wasn't Tamara's style, but Carla couldn't just sit back and let the people who had supported her all these years see her own sister treated unfairly. Carla's entire career had been built on fighting for justice and equity, and now it seemed that her sister's experience was about to become a public reflection of the town's failure to live up to those ideals. Tamara's name had become a symbol not just of systemic racial injustice, but of the hypocrisy that often lurked behind the town's shiny promises of progress. Carla knew that she couldn't remain silent on this. She couldn't afford to. But as much as her heart burned with anger, she also knew that the town wasn't ready for an all-out political battle. If she spoke too openly, too soon, it would divide the town even further, and if she didn't address it at all, it would undermine everything she had fought for. Determined to find a way forward, Carla called for a private meeting with Judge Robert Mills. She needed to hear from him directly, to understand where he stood, and to make sure the right thing was done. She wasn't prepared for the cold reception she received when she walked into his office. Mills, who had always maintained a detached professionalism, didn't seem interested in hearing her side of the story. "I made my decision, Mayor. The law is the law," he said firmly, his voice unyielding. "I don't see how anything could change that." Carla's eyes narrowed, and her voice remained calm but carried an unmistakable edge. "It's not about the law, Robert. It's about fairness. It's about the system that you claim to uphold but continue to ignore. You can't hide behind the law when the system itself is broken." Mills looked away, his face betraying a flicker of doubt, but he quickly suppressed it. "I'm not here to entertain accusations of bias, Carla. I did what was necessary. If your sister had been anyone else, the fine would have been the same." Carla's jaw tightened. "You don't get it, do you? This is about more than one woman. This is about what the people in this town believe they can get away with. About how you view people like my sister, like me, like many others, as less than. We are always other in your eyes. And you know what? I'm not going to let that go. Not now, not ever." Mills' eyes flickered, and for the first time, Carla saw a crack in his usually impenetrable demeanor. He didn't respond immediately, his mind visibly working through her words. Carla had been known for her calm yet forceful leadership style, but now, standing in front of this judge, she felt the weight of her words. This wasn't just about her sister's fine. It was about the very foundation of justice, or the lack thereof, in their town. The silence between them stretched as Carla waited for a response, unsure if she had made any impact. But it didn't take long for Mills to finally speak again, his tone softer but still defensive. I never intended to hurt anyone, but it's clear now that my actions have consequences. I'll reconsider the fine, he said reluctantly, almost as though the words were being forced from him. Carla could see that he was wrestling with something, his own prejudices, perhaps, or the realization that he had underestimated the power of his decisions. She knew that this wasn't going to be the end of it, that public opinion would soon turn the heat up even more. But at least in this moment, the judge had acknowledged that something needed to change. As she left his office, Carla felt a sense of resolve settle over her. She would fight for her sister and for the people who didn't have the privilege of being heard. She wouldn't let this incident be brushed under the rug. Not now, not ever. The battle for justice was far from over, but at least now there was a crack in the armor, a sign that things could be different if they pushed hard enough. But Tamara, for her part, had already made up her mind. She wasn't going to let her sister carry this burden alone. She had stood in the shadows for too long. The next move was hers. The day after the meeting between Carla and Judge Mills, the situation in the town escalated. News outlets picked up the story that Carla Davis had intervened on behalf of her sister, and the debate over fairness and bias in the justice system took on new dimensions. The issue was no longer just about Tamara's fine. It had become a political hot potato, with people on both sides of the aisle weighing in. Some praised Carla for stepping in and holding the justice system accountable, while others accused her of using her power to protect her family, claiming she was overstepping her role as mayor. But amidst all the noise, one thing became clear. Tamara was no longer just a private citizen caught in a minor legal matter. She was now a symbol, a representative of the struggles faced by Black individuals in a town that still clung to old prejudices. For Tamara, the attention was overwhelming. She never sought to be at the center of a political firestorm, but the situation was spiraling, and it seemed like there was no way out. The people who had always supported her were now watching closely, wondering if she would back down or take the opportunity to demand real change. It was no longer just her sister's fight. It was hers as well. Tamara was torn between the desire for privacy and the growing responsibility to use this moment for something greater. Sitting alone in her small apartment that evening, Tamara stared out of the window at the town she had once known so well. The sun had set, and the streets below were bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. She had spent years away from this place, building a life and a career, but now it seemed like everything was coming back to her with an intensity she hadn't expected. She thought about the conversations she had had with her sister, about the paths they had taken in their lives. Carla had chosen politics, pushing for visible, structural change. Tamara had chosen activism, working in the trenches where people's lives were affected by policies and decisions made by people like Judge Mills. It was only now, after everything had happened, that Tamara began to question how effective her own methods had been. Had she done enough? Had she stayed too silent, too often, when she could have fought harder? She had always believed in pushing for change without seeking the spotlight, but now it seemed like the spotlight was unavoidable. That night, as Tamara lay in bed, she felt a sudden shift inside herself. The quiet frustration that had been building over the past few days crystallized into something more powerful, something clear and resolute. She could no longer stand by and let this moment pass. The incident with the fine, the judge's cold dismissal of her, was just one example of a system that treated people like her differently, unfairly. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel less than, who had been silenced by the power structures that governed their lives. Tamara knew that this was a pivotal moment. If she let it go, if she allowed the system to continue as it was, the cycle of injustice would repeat itself. If she wanted to see change, she would have to be the one to fight for it, even if it meant stepping into the very public role she had always avoided. It was time to stop being a bystander in her own story. The next day, Tamara called a press conference. She hadn't fully prepared for what she was about to do, but she knew she couldn't wait any longer. The pressure had been building for days, and she was done holding her tongue. When she stood before the cameras that afternoon, the crowd of reporters and activists gathered around her. She felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. But she stood tall, focused, and began to speak. "I'm here today because I believe it's time for change," Tamara began, her voice calm but firm. "I believe in justice. But justice isn't something we can take for granted. It's something we have to fight for every single day. And when I see people like Judge Mills using their power to dismiss lives like mine, like the lives of so many in this town, I can't remain silent anymore. It's not just about me. It's about all of us." She paused, feeling the weight of the words settle in the room. The press was silent, waiting for her to continue. "Today, I'm not just asking for my fine to be reconsidered. I'm asking for all of us to look at the way we treat each other in this town. I'm asking for real change, change that isn't just on paper, but change that impacts how we live and how we treat those who are often overlooked. We can do better. We must do better." The words were out, and there was no taking them back. But Tamara didn't want to. For the first time, she felt a sense of clarity and purpose that had been missing for far too long. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Whether she was ready or not, she was stepping into the fight. The press conference immediately took off, sparking an intense wave of reactions from both sides of the town. Supporters of Tamara's message flooded social media with hashtags like #JusticeForTamara and #ChangeInOurTown. Her words resonated with many who had long felt silenced by a system that seemed to overlook their struggles. People came forward, sharing their own stories of unfair treatment and inequality, drawing parallels to Tamara's own experience. For many, this wasn't just about one woman's fine. It was a rallying cry for the community to confront the injustices that had been quietly perpetuated for years. On the other hand, those who felt aligned with Judge Mills or the more conservative factions in the town began to push back. They criticized Tamara for making the issue personal, accusing her of turning a minor legal matter into a spectacle for political gain. Some even questioned whether Carla Davis had coerced her sister into speaking out for her own political benefit. The division between the town's two major factions grew even more pronounced as the story continued to spread. But for Tamara, the criticism didn't matter as much as the larger issue at hand. She had stepped into the spotlight, not because she wanted fame or approval, but because the town needed to confront its flaws, no matter how uncomfortable the truth was. And now it was time for her to push for concrete action. The following day, Tamara sat down with a group of local activists, community leaders, and legal experts to discuss the next steps. She knew this fight was bigger than her, and she needed a strong, unified plan. It was clear to everyone that the systemic issues in the town went far beyond a single judge or a single incident. They had to approach this challenge with a long-term strategy, one that involved not only holding Judge Mills accountable, but also pushing for reform in the justice system, better community engagement, and policies that would address the root causes of racial disparities. "The fight doesn't stop with one fine," Tamara said to the group. "We need to change the system that created this situation in the first place. We have to hold people in positions of power accountable, not just with words, but with action." The conversation quickly turned to legal action. Several members of the group suggested filing a formal complaint against Judge Mills for his handling of Tamara's case, accusing him of racial bias and misconduct. Others believed that the most effective strategy would be to target local government policies that allowed such inequities to persist. Tamara, however, had a different idea. She wanted to make a broader impact by organizing a town-wide summit on racial justice, inviting all sectors of the community, from law enforcement to business leaders, educators, and activists, to engage in an open dialogue about how to move forward. "I want this town to have a real conversation," Tamara said, her determination unwavering. "Not just a protest or a meeting that gets swept under the rug. I want people to see the depth of this issue and to understand why it matters, not just to me, but to everyone in this town who's been affected by this broken system." Over the next few weeks, Tamara and the coalition she had formed worked tirelessly to organize the summit. Flyers were distributed, meetings were held, and local media outlets began covering the preparations. Some residents expressed skepticism, questioning whether anything would truly change. Others were more hopeful, seeing it as an opportunity to air their grievances and start a meaningful dialogue. But the most significant shift happened within Tamara herself. As the days went by, she realized that she wasn't just fighting for justice for herself or even her family. She was fighting for a future where her community could thrive, where people no longer had to fear the very system that was supposed to protect them. It was a daunting task, and she had moments of doubt, but she couldn't afford to let fear control her actions now. She had come too far. The summit was scheduled for the following month, and as the date drew near, Tamara found herself bracing for what would surely be a difficult and emotionally charged event. The path ahead would not be easy, but she was ready for the challenge. She had already stepped into the fight, and now she was determined to see it through. Her actions had sparked a movement, and no matter the outcome, Tamara knew this was only the beginning of the change her town desperately needed. But change was never easy, and she was ready to face whatever came next with courage and conviction. The day of the summit arrived, and the tension in the town was palpable. Tamara stood at the front of the large community center, the venue packed with residents, media, and representatives from various sectors of the town. There were people from all walks of life: activists, local business owners, law enforcement officers, students, and families, gathered in one room to confront the pressing issues that had been left unaddressed for so long. The energy in the room was thick, a mix of hope, skepticism, and anticipation. As the event began, Tamara took a deep breath, standing at the podium. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, refining her message, practicing her delivery. But now that she was here, she realized how high the stakes were. This wasn't just another speech. This was the beginning of a movement. She wasn't just speaking to the crowd in front of her. She was speaking to the heart of the town itself. "I want to start by thanking each of you for being here," Tamara began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Today, we are going to talk about something that's been ignored for too long: the way this town's systems, especially our justice system, have failed people of color. And not just in theory, not just in abstract terms, but in real lives, real people." She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was quiet, every ear trained on her. Tamara could feel the weight of all the eyes on her, some supportive, some skeptical, but all waiting to hear what came next. "We are here today because we cannot keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not. We cannot keep accepting the narrative that everything is equal when it's not. My experience was just the tip of the iceberg. And if we don't address it, if we don't change the way things are, this town will never be the place we say it is. This is not just my fight. This is our fight." A ripple of applause spread through the room. Tamara wasn't sure if everyone agreed with her completely, but the support was undeniable. It was clear that the conversation had shifted. No longer could people sit idly by and let the injustices of the past continue to shape their present. The summit proceeded with a series of panel discussions and breakout sessions. Local leaders discussed police practices, disparities in education and employment, and the need for restorative justice policies. Tamara sat in on many of these discussions, listening intently and offering her own thoughts when needed. But she could see the tension simmering beneath the surface. There were those who didn't want to face the uncomfortable truths. Some members of the law enforcement panel seemed defensive, unwilling to acknowledge the systemic racism that had been embedded in their practices. Other residents voiced frustrations about feeling unheard, dismissed, and forgotten. The most challenging part of the summit came during a tea and a session. A local businessman, someone who had always been a staunch supporter of the town's police force, stood up, his voice cutting through the room. "What are you trying to say, Tamara? That we're all racists here? That the whole system is corrupt?" he asked, his tone accusatory. "We've all worked hard to build this community, and you're making it sound like it's all a failure." Tamara felt a momentary pang of frustration, but she refused to let it deter her. She had expected this kind of resistance. She took a deep breath and replied, her voice firm but calm. "No," she said. "What I'm saying is that the system is not as fair as we want to believe it is. That doesn't mean every person is bad or intentionally cruel. It means that there are flaws, deep flaws, that we've allowed to persist. The question is not whether you're a good person, it's whether we, as a community, are willing to admit that there's more work to be done. Are we willing to look at the way things are and take the hard steps to make them better for everyone?" The businessman looked at her, clearly uncomfortable, but he didn't respond. The room was silent for a moment, and then another voice spoke up. A woman, a teacher at the local high school, stood from her seat. "I've seen it," she said. "I've seen the ways our students are treated differently depending on their skin color. I've seen the way that some of my black students are constantly overlooked, dismissed, or punished more harshly. We have to talk about this. We can't just pretend it's not happening." Tamara felt a surge of emotion. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was the fight of the community as a whole. This summit, this dialogue, was the beginning of something bigger, something that had the potential to change the very fabric of their town. By the end of the summit, while not everyone had agreed on every point, something remarkable had happened. The town had begun to talk, to truly talk, about the systemic issues that had been buried for years. There was a sense of urgency in the air, a feeling that the moment for change had arrived. As the event drew to a close, Tamara looked around the room, seeing both tension and hope in the faces of her fellow townspeople. It was far from over, but this summit had planted the seed for real change. The fight for justice was just beginning, and Tamara knew that no matter what came next, she was ready to lead it. In the days following the summit, the town seemed to undergo a transformation. The conversations that had been ignited in the community center began to spill into the streets, the coffee shops, and the schools. People who had never before discussed issues of race or justice found themselves engaging in difficult but necessary conversations. There was still resistance, there always would be, but Tamara could sense that the tide was slowly turning. The summit had not just been a one-time event, it had sparked a movement, one that couldn't be undone. The local media continued to cover the aftermath, highlighting the diverse voices that had spoken out at the event. The voices of teachers, activists, and community leaders who had been advocating for change for years were now being amplified. The town's newspapers and news stations, which had once been hesitant to discuss racial inequality openly, now found themselves covering the stories of people who had long felt marginalized. People were sharing their experiences, and others were listening in ways they never had before. It was as if the town was waking up to the realities it had been too comfortable ignoring. But with this newfound attention also came pressure. Tamara's phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages, some from supporters, others from people who still refused to accept the need for change. The heat on Carla, too, intensified. As mayor, she had to navigate her position carefully, balancing the demands of those who wanted to maintain the status quo with the growing chorus of those calling for reform. Her own role in the conflict had become a point of contention, and people in her office began urging her to distance herself from Tamara, worried that the political fallout could hurt her standing in the next election. Carla, however, was steadfast. She had always believed in the importance of doing what was right, even when it wasn't popular. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she was not going to back down from the responsibility she had taken on. She had always fought for equity, and now, more than ever, she felt the weight of that fight. Meanwhile, Judge Mills found himself at the center of a growing controversy. The formal complaints against him were being reviewed, and there were calls for an investigation into his handling of Tamara's case. While he had initially resisted acknowledging any wrongdoing, the pressure continued to mount. A local law firm had offered to represent Tamara in a civil suit, aiming to not only challenge his decision in her case, but also to push for reforms in the way the local judicial system handled cases involving racial bias. The calls for his resignation grew louder, and soon, even those who had once defended him began to question his judgment. Tamara, however, remained focused on the bigger picture. The goal was never just to target one individual, it was about creating lasting change. She continued to meet with activists and legal experts, strategizing about the next steps. It was clear that the battle was not over, but Tamara now had the confidence to face it head on. She was no longer the woman who had quietly endured injustice. She was a leader, a force for change in her town. A few weeks later, at a town hall meeting, Tamara stood before a packed room of her fellow residents. Carla was by her side, offering silent support as her sister spoke. The judge's resignation had been announced, and though it was a victory, it was only one small step. Tamara addressed the crowd with a sense of resolve in her voice. "We've made progress," she began, "but this is just the beginning. This town has a long way to go, and it's up to all of us to make sure we don't stop here. We've started a conversation, but now we need action. We need to ensure that our systems, our schools, our police, our courts, work for everyone, no matter their race or background. This is the work of the community, not just a few of us, but all of us." Her words were met with a mixture of applause and thoughtful silence. The crowd understood. Change was hard, and it was a slow process, but it was possible, and they were ready to take the next steps. As the meeting ended, Tamara stepped down from the stage, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. She had set something in motion, and now the work would continue. There were still challenges ahead. There would always be challenges. But for the first time in a long while, Tamara felt hopeful. She wasn't alone in this fight. Her town had finally seen the truth, and together, they would work to ensure it never returned to the way it had been before. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Tamara was no longer just a woman fighting for justice in the shadows. She had stepped into the light, and now she would lead the charge for a better tomorrow.